They were building machines that could run for 30 years without major repair, and that's exactly what killed them. Danarm didn't fail because their equipment was bad. They failed because it was too good. By the early 1980s, their cylinder mowers and two-stroke chainsaws had saturated Britain so completely that customers stopped replacing them. The machines just wouldn't die. And when the replacement cycle finally did arrive, the company that had fed 3 generations of British gardeners was already gone, bought, gutted, and erased by a supply chain they never saw coming. Why couldn't a company with bulletproof engineering survive contact with Honda? What did Danarm's engineers actually build into those machines that made them last so unnaturally long? And who profited when Danarm collapsed? And why does no one admit they saw it coming? Start in 1968, a terrace house in Stroud Green, North London. The smell is two-stroke exhaust and cut grass. The sound is a high whine from a 98cc Villiers engine mounted on a rotary deck. The man pushing it is not a professional groundskeeper, he's a postman. And the mower he's using, a Danarm petrol rotary, Model 18, will outlive his career, his mortgage, and eventually the company that made it. Danarm entered the British market in the early 1960s, but they didn't enter it the way most people think. They didn't invent the garden tools. They inherited them from a network of military subcontractors who'd been building portable engine systems for entirely different reasons. The core of Danarm's engineering came from wartime production contracts. Lightweight aluminum castings, modular two-stroke engines, air-cooled systems designed for durability under inconsistent fuel quality. These weren't consumer products. They were infantry equipment. Generators for field radios, portable pumps, engine-driven saws for rapid airfield construction. The sort of things you designed once and never touched again because retooling cost more than the contract was worth. After the war, the factories that made them had a problem. Thousands of square feet of tooling capacity and no one left to supply. So they pivoted. The same casting molds that had made generator housings in 1943 were pouring lawnmower decks by 1961. Same aluminum alloy, same thickness, massively over-engineered for suburban lawns, but that was the point. Danarm's first rotary mowers weighed nearly twice what a Flymo did, but they didn't crack, they didn't warp. You could leave one outside through a British winter, pull the cord in March, and it would start on the second pull. The engineering tolerances weren't designed for planned obsolescence. They were designed for Norway in February. And for 15 years, that was enough. But by 1977, Danarm's best-selling rotary model, the 18-inch deck with the Aspera engine, had a replacement cycle of nearly 11 years. Walk through a British garden center in 1979. The Danarm section is small, 4 models, 2 rotaries, 1 cylinder mower, 1 edge trimmer. No bright colors, no promotional end caps. The sales assistant doesn't push them. He doesn't need to. The customer already knows someone who owns one. That's the entire marketing strategy. Word of mouth, longevity as brand identity. It worked until the market saturated. Danarm's problem wasn't competition. It was exhaustion. They'd sold too well for too long. Every lawn that needed a Danarm already had one, and those machines refused to break. Now add the second pressure, parts. Danarm didn't manufacture their own engines. They assembled. Villiers supplied the 2-strokes. Aspera supplied the 4-strokes. Both companies built to the same military surplus durability model. And both companies, by the mid-1970s, were being undercut by a new supply chain most British firms didn't even know existed yet. It came from Japan, but it didn't arrive as competition. It arrived as components. Honda didn't enter the British garden equipment market by selling lawnmowers. They entered it by selling engines to the companies that made lawnmowers. Compact 4-stroke motors, the GX series. Lightweight, low vibration, cleaner emissions than anything Villiers or Aspera made, and crucially, cheaper to buy even after shipping from Suzuka. Danarm's purchasing managers saw the price sheets in 1976. They didn't switch. That decision is still argued about in trade journals. Some call it pride, others call it loyalty to British suppliers. But the engineers who were there say it was something simpler. They didn't believe the GX engines would last. They were wrong, but not in the way they expected. The GX engines didn't last as long as a Villiers. They lasted long enough. And that distinction between 30-year durability and 12-year durability was the margin where Danarm died. Because 12 years was exactly the replacement cycle the market wanted. By 1980, Honda had done something no British supplier ever considered. They'd reverse-engineered the consumer's tolerance for failure. They built motors that would run for a decade under normal use, then begin to show wear. Not catastrophic failure, just enough decline in performance that replacement felt reasonable. Planned longevity, the opposite of planned obsolescence, but with the same outcome. And they sold those engines to everyone, including Danarm's competitors, including firms that had never made garden equipment before, including hardware chains that realized they could source a Honda-powered rotary from a no-name contractor in the Midlands for half what Danarm charged. Danarm's sales didn't collapse. They eroded. 1979 was down 11% from 1978. 1980 was down 18% from 1979. The product quality hadn't changed. The brand reputation hadn't changed. The customer base had just aged out. The postman in Stroud Green was still using his 1968 Model 18. He had no reason to buy another. Danarm's managing director, a man named Colin Treadwell, tried to solve this the only way he knew how. He doubled down on durability. In 1981, Danarm released an updated cylinder mower with a reinforced blade cartridge designed to last 15 years between resharpenings. It was beautiful engineering. It was also commercial suicide. The people who wanted a 15-year blade cartridge already owned a Danarm. The people who didn't weren't shopping at the price point Danarm needed to survive. The company started losing money in 1982. Not much, enough. And that's when the supply chain made its second move. Honda didn't just sell engines. They sold support, training programs for repair techs, subsidized parts inventory for retailers, diagnostic manuals translated into 14 languages. A dealer who stocked Honda-powered equipment got access to a service network that Danarm, assembling machines from 3 different suppliers, couldn't match. By 1983, more than 60% of new garden equipment sold in the UK had a Honda engine. Danarm's market share was 7% and falling. Picture the Danarm factory in Haverhill, Suffolk, in early 1984. It's a small facility, 2 assembly lines. The smell is cutting oil and powder coat. There are fewer than 70 people on the floor. Half of them have been there since the 1960s. They know the tooling. They know the tolerance specs. They know how to true a blade deck to within 1/1000th of an inch. And none of that knowledge mattered anymore, because the market had stopped rewarding precision. It started rewarding availability. A customer walking into a garden center in 1984 didn't ask for a Danarm. They asked for a mower that was in stock, that they could take home today, that came with a parts guarantee. Honda-powered brands delivered all 3. Danarm delivered none. Their lead times stretched to 6 weeks. Their dealer network had shrunk, and their warranty claims, vanishingly rare, took weeks to process because the company was too small to stock replacement assemblies. They were still building better machines. They just couldn't deliver them fast enough. In May of 1984, Colin Treadwell received an acquisition offer. It came from a Midlands-based conglomerate called Parvalux. They made electric motors, small-batch industrial controllers, gearboxes for conveyor systems. They had no consumer presence, no brand, and no interest in Danarm's engineering. What they wanted was shelf space. Parvalux didn't buy Danarm to save it. They bought it to occupy the retail relationships Danarm still had, and then fill those relationships with cheaper, Honda-powered models assembled elsewhere. This is the answer to the first question. Danarm couldn't survive contact with Honda because Honda wasn't competing on quality. They were competing on system integration. Honda didn't just sell a product. They sold the entire supply chain around it. Parts, training, distribution, service. Danarm sold machines. And in a market that had matured past the point where the machine itself was the bottleneck, that difference was fatal. The Haverhill factory closed in December 1984. The tooling was auctioned off in lots. The casting molds, the ones that had made generator housings in 1943 and mower decks in 1968, were sold for scrap weight. Aluminum alloy, paid by the kilogram. For a few years, the Danarm name persisted. Parvalux kept it on rebadged models. Same logos, different guts. A Danarm rotary sold in 1987 had a Honda GX 120 engine, a stamped steel deck, and a warranty service through a call center in Swindon. It was lighter than the original, louder. It lasted about 9 years. But here's the part that haunts the trade historians. Those original Danarms, the 1960s and 70s models, the over-engineered military surplus machines, are still out there. You'll find them at car boot sales, in garden sheds behind terrace houses in Stroud Green, painted over, rusted, still running. There's a small online market for them now. Restoration hobbyists, people who want a mower that doesn't need an ECU or a solenoid interlock. But nobody's restoring them because they're rare. They're restoring them because they're still common. So here's the second answer. What Danarm built into those machines wasn't just durability. It was a tolerance for neglect. You could store one wrong, fuel it wrong, leave it outside for a winter, and it would still start. That came from the military engineering baseline, designed for users who won't maintain it, in conditions you can't predict, with fuel quality you can't control. It was brilliant engineering. It was terrible business strategy. Because the consumer market doesn't reward machines that never need replacing. It punishes them. This is the trap that caught half the post-war British manufacturing sector. Build something too well, and you collapse your old replacement cycle. Danarm did it with mowers. Valor did it with heaters. Petter did it with diesel engines. They all had the same foundation, military-spec durability applied to civilian markets. And they all discovered the same thing. The market didn't want invincible products. It wanted adequate products with invincible supply chains. Honda understood that. Danarm never did. There's a deeper irony. By the early 1990s, Honda itself had started making some of the same mistakes. The GX series engines were so reliable that replacement demand softened. Warranty claims dropped below 1%. Dealers complained they couldn't sell service contracts. So Honda did something Danarm would never have considered. They started shipping engines with shorter maintenance intervals. Not because the engines needed it, because the business model needed it. More frequent oil changes, more frequent filter swaps, more touch points, more reasons to return to the dealer. It wasn't planned obsolescence. It was planned engagement. It worked. And it proved something Danarm's engineers would have hated. In consumer markets, durability alone is not enough. But that still leaves the third question. Who profited when Danarm collapsed? The obvious answer is Honda, but that's incomplete. Honda made margin on engines. The real money, the volume profit, went to the no-name assemblers who bolted those engines onto cheap decks and sold them through hardware chains that had never stocked garden equipment before. Companies you've never heard of: Westwood, Mountfield, Sovereign, which was just a rebadge label for Homebase. They didn't have R&D departments. They didn't have engineers. They had supply agreements and distribution contracts. And they made more profit per unit than Danarm ever did, because they stopped designing the product and started designing the transaction. This is the shift that killed the mid-tier British manufacturing sector in the 1980s. It wasn't offshoring. It wasn't cheaper labor. It was the realization that you could make more money assembling someone else's components than you could engineering your own. Danarm's engineers saw it happening. They wrote memos about it. Colin Treadwell kept some of them. One, dated March 1983, warned that the company's competitive advantage, durability, was being perceived by customers as a liability. They don't want a mower that lasts 30 years. They want a mower that matches the aesthetic of their current patio set and costs less than a weekend in Brighton. The memo recommended pivoting to modular design, swappable engines, lighter materials, shorter service life. He wasn't an ideologue. He just didn't believe the market had actually shifted. He thought it was a pricing problem, a marketing problem, a distribution problem, anything but a product problem, because the product was still the best thing on the market. You could measure it: vibration dampening, engine runtime, deck warp under load. Danarm won on every metric, except the one that mattered: sales. And that's where the story gets strange, because after Parvelux bought Danarm and closed the factory, some of the tooling didn't get scrapped. It disappeared. Not all of it, just the molds for the cylinder mower blade cartridges and the deck castings for the Model 18 rotary. They turned up in Ireland, in the small contract manufacturing facility outside Cork. And for about 6 years, 1987 to 1993, that facility produced parts. Not for Parvelux, not for any brand you'd recognize, for a gray market repair network that serviced the thousands of original Danarms still in use across the UK and Ireland. The parts were sold through small ads in the back of gardening magazines. No warranties, no branding, just part numbers and a P.O. box in County Clare. No one knows who funded it. The facility closed in 1993. The tooling vanished again. Some people think it was bought by a Chinese contractor. Others think it's still in a warehouse somewhere in Ireland, waiting for scrap prices to rise. So here's the final answer. The people who profited from Danarm's collapse weren't the ones who replaced them in the market. It was the ones who inherited the service tail, the parts suppliers, the repair networks, the hobbyists who realized there were tens of thousands of indestructible machines out there that would eventually need gaskets, carburetors, belts, and no official supplier. That market still exists, and it's worth more now than it was in 1984. Walk through a British car boot sale today. You'll see them. Danarm rotaries with peeling decals, cylinder mowers with pitted blades, two-stroke chainsaws with cracked fuel lines. People buy them for 15 quid. Take them home, clean the carburetor, replace the pull cord, and they run. Because they were built to a standard the market no longer supports. And that's the entire tragedy in one sentence. Danarm didn't fail because they built bad products. They failed because they built products the market had already moved past. Honda didn't beat them with better engineering. Honda beat them with better logistics, better dealer support, better parts availability, better alignment between product lifespan and replacement psychology. It's the same pattern that killed British Leyland, the same pattern that killed Triumph motorcycles, the same pattern that nearly killed Jaguar. You can still see it happening. Different industries, same dynamic. Danarm is a case study now. Business schools use it to teach market life cycle theory. The product was phase 1. The supply chain was phase 2. Danarm mastered phase 1 and never saw phase 2 coming. But here's what the case studies don't mention. There are people inside Honda, retired engineers, supply chain managers from the 1980s, who still talk about Danarm. Not as a competitor they beat, as a warning, because Honda's watching their own replacement cycles slow down. The GX engines they built in the 1990s are still running. The mowers they powered are lasting 15-20 years, and the consumer market is starting to resent it. There's a term for it in Japanese industrial strategy, Jisadai no wana. The next generation trap. Build something too durable, and you eliminate your own future customers. It's the same trap, different decade. And the companies currently falling into it are the ones that learned from Danarm's collapse and then forgot the lesson. Tesla's facing it with battery packs. Miele's facing it with washing machines. Steel is facing it with chainsaws. They all built products that last longer than the business model can survive. There's a Danarm Model 18 rotary mower in a shed in Leicestershire. It's 54 years old. Original engine, original deck. The fuel line's been replaced twice. The blade's been resharpened 11 times. The pull cord is frayed but functional. The man who owns it bought it from his father's estate. His father bought it new in 1970. He was offered 300 quid for it last summer. He turned it down. Not because it's worth more, because he doesn't believe he could replace it with anything that would last as long. And he's right, because the companies that could build a machine like that don't exist anymore. And the companies that do exist have no financial incentive to try. That's what Danarm's collapse actually proved. Not that durability doesn't matter, but that in a consumer market driven by replacement cycles, fashion shifts, and supply chain margin optimization, durability is a defect. It's the wrong kind of quality. And once the market decides that, no amount of engineering excellence will save you. The Danarm name still exists, technically. It's owned by a holding company in Luxembourg. They've never used it. It just sits in a trademark portfolio alongside 40 other dead brands from the 1980s. No products, no legacy, just a registration renewed every 10 years to prevent anyone else from claiming it. Why bother? Because someday, someone might want to sell the nostalgia. Not the product, not the engineering. Just the memory of a time when things were built to last, back before the market decided that was a problem to be solved. But here's the detail nobody at Parvelux will confirm. Somewhere in their acquisition records from 1984, there's a line item for retained tooling and intellectual property. It's valued at £9,000. And according to someone who saw the paperwork before it was archived, it includes more than just parts molds. It includes design schematics for a prototype Danarm never released, a hybrid mower, electric start, modular engine mount, swappable deck widths, everything the 1983 memo recommended. Treadwell had approved it 3 weeks before he accepted the buyout offer. So why didn't he mention it during negotiations? Why isn't it in any of the public records? And why did Parvelux bury it in an acquisition line item instead of bringing it to market? No one who was in the room will say, but if you ever find yourself in a garden shed in Stroud Green, looking at a 50-year-old Danarm that still starts on the second pull, you might wonder what the British garden equipment market would look like now if that prototype had shipped, and whether Danarm died because they couldn't adapt, or because someone decided they shouldn't be allowed to.